आदाब, यह है समय न्यूज नेटवर्क और आप देख रहे हैं आलमी समय। हमारे खास प्रोग्राम एक मुलाकात में आपका खैर मकदम है। एक मुलाकात में आज हमारी मुलाकात हो रही है अमेरिका से तशरीफ लाए अमेरिका के सेंटर ऑन फॉरेन रिलेशन से वाबस्ता स्टीवन ए कुक। स्टीवन ए कुक आपका आलमी समय में खैर मकदम है। स्टीवन ए कुक, in your opinion, what is the real problem of the Middle East? I'll start from this.
The real problem in the Middle East, I'm afraid we don't have enough time to fully answer the question, but I think what's happening in the Middle East is that Middle Easterners are engaged in a high-stakes debate about their national identities, about the organizational principles around which they'd like their governments to be formed, about the relationship between religion and society, about religion and the state, what it means to be an Egyptian or a Syrian or a Palestinian in the world right now is something that's subject to, let me say, it's open for debate, and the Arab world is engaged in this
debate. Let us start from Syria. So, you are trying to, U.S. is trying to attack Syria, or U.S. plan to attack Syria on the pretext of chemical weapons, use of chemical weapons. But do you think that only Syria in the region is having chemical weapons?
Well, first of all, the United States hasn't attacked Syria, and for now, President Obama has asked the Congress to table his resolution asking for authorization to attack Syria. I think that certainly Syria isn't the only country in the region that has chemical weapons, but it is the only country in the region that is using chemical weapons against its own people.
It has been reported
it is the only country
in the international media that Israel used chemical weapons in Gaza, in West Bank.
It's the only country in the region that's displaced 2 million of its own people.
Do you think that the way Afghanistan was treated, the way Iraq was treated by the U.S., on the same track Syria is going, because it has been reported that rebels are being funded in Afghanistan to counter Soviet Union rebels where rebels were funded. The same situation will be created in Syria after 1 or 2 years.
I think that the United States made some mistakes in Afghanistan in the 1980s. I think the United States made mistakes in Iraq in the 2000s. I think the debate that you're seeing in the United States now about intervention in Syria, and the very serious question that American lawmakers are asking about the prospect of intervening in Syria. The fact that the President has gone to the Congress and asked for their advice and their consent suggests that the United States is trying to avoid making the same kinds of mistakes that it made in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And one of the things that is foremost in the minds of policymakers in Washington is who the United States would be aiding in intervening in Syria. And that's why, to this date, we have not intervened in Syria. I will point out to you the countries that have intervened in Syria. They are Russia, Iran, and not a country, but certainly a powerful force, Hezbollah. Those are the countries that have directly intervened in Syria. The United States hasn't intervened in Syria yet. And it's not likely to intervene in Syria.
But now, because the U.S. has, U.S. has dropped the idea of attacking Syria, it seems, because
for the moment, yes,
yeah, for the moment. But do you think this is the diplomatic victory of Syria over the U.S.?
Well, I don't know whether it's a diplomatic victory for Syria or not.
Indirectly, diplomatic victory of Iran.
I think the concern that many have raised is that the Russians and the Syrians have used this diplomatic initiative to relieve pressure on the Assad regime to allow it to go on killing its own people without fear of international retribution. But let's remember what we're talking about here. We're talking about a dictator that has killed 100,000 of its own people and displaced 2 million of his own people. It's unfortunate that the Russian government and the Iranian government are enabling the continued massacre of people in Syria.
But do you think that only Assad is the only dictator in the region? Because there are many dictators in the region.
Well, there certainly are dictators. There are certainly dictators in the region, and there certainly have been dictators that have been aligned with the United States. The times, though, have changed. Some of Washington's most important dictators are no longer in office, and I think it is not the time to be turning a blind eye to the humanitarian disaster in Syria, and it's not time to be turning a blind eye to those who in the international community are enabling that humanitarian disaster. It certainly hasn't been the United States that has been enabling that disaster. The United States has been trying to limit its involvement and limit the damage that this conflict has created for Turkey, for Jordan, for Lebanon, whilst the Iranian government and the Russian governments have enabled the Syrian government to continue its slaughter of its own people.
But humanitarian crisis or humanitarian disaster not only happened in Syria only. If we compare with the Israel-Palestine, daily there is a lot of human crisis, human rights violation in Syria, in Palestine also.
Well, I don't think.
Why not add questions? The U.S. raises questions.
I think that that's absolutely right. There are human rights violations going on in Gaza and the West Bank. I think that the United States, along with the international community, has been quite active in trying to relieve the humanitarian problems in Gaza and Syria. The United States is one of the largest donors to the Palestinian Authority, and the United States alone has sought to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict, to bring some justice to the Palestinian people that they very much deserve. It is because, however, of both the Palestinians and the Israelis that the United States has not been able to forge peace in the region. But let me turn that back on to your viewers. Here is the United States and the Europeans who have been generous with our funds and have been supporting the Palestinian Authority, supporting relief works agencies for the Palestinians. What had Indians been doing to support the human rights and the relief of the Palestinians? It's important for the entire international community to be involved. It's important for large democratic countries, post-colonial countries like India, to also be engaged on these issues and assist the United States in helping to relieve the suffering in places like the West Bank and the Gaza Strip.
Traditionally, India and Arab countries are, we are having close relations, and India has always stood with the Palestinian people. India has always raised questions on human rights violations there.
I think that India should be commended for its principled position on this, but in what, other than rhetorically, has India done in order to help relieve the suffering? It certainly pales in comparison to the kinds of things that the United States has done over the course of many years to try to, as I said, relieve the suffering of the Palestinians through American largesse, as well as the time and effort that the United States has committed to resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict. Not an easy thing, but the United States very often is alone in that effort.
As far as Israel's human rights violation or Israel-Palestine issue is concerned, recently U.S. said that Russia and China, they have made UNSC captive because of on the issue of Syria and through their veto. But it is really, I'm sorry to say that on Israel, it is the U.S. which has used most of the time its veto in favor of Israel, and human rights violation is going on there, but U.S. doesn't raise question.
Well, I think that's right. I think that the United States calculates its interests in certain ways and has wielded the veto power in the same way that the Russian government has wielded its veto power. I think that the way in which Washington views the world is very different from the way in which Moscow does. I think that when you get down to it, however, the Syrian government, on behalf of whom the Russian government is using its veto, is engaged in a brutal civil war, has killed hundreds of thousands of people and displaced many. That's not to say that the Israelis haven't killed a lot of people and haven't displaced many people as well. But if we're focusing on the Syrian conflict, let's keep in mind that it's very hard to imagine, it's very hard for Americans, it's very hard for the American government to imagine why a country would support another country that is engaged in the wholesale slaughter of its own people. I think the Arab-Israeli conflict is something qualitatively different from the civil war that's happening in Syria. I think that it is a tragic historic conflict between two peoples who claim the same land, and that objectively speaking, if you look at the two claims, they each have equal claim. As I said, the United States has worked very, very hard over a very long period of time to try to establish some sort of justice for the Palestinian people, although its interests dictate that it supports Israel at the same time.
What will you say when in Annapolis, Hillary Clinton promised that by 2010, Palestinian problem will be resolved, and exactly in 2010, the Arab Spring was started. Mm-hmm. Some people say, some experts say that it was, it was started because U.S. didn't want to resolve the Palestinian issue. Well, the Arab Spring is the reason of that.
Whoever those experts are aren't really much experts in the Middle East. They're really just engaging in wild conspiracy theorizing. The United States did not start the Arab Spring. This was a genuine expression of people movement in Tunisia and Egypt. I was in Egypt for the Egyptian uprising. I tell you, there was no hidden hand, no foreign hand seeking to thwart peace between Arabs and Israelis. The United States has not been successful in helping to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict, not because the United States doesn't want it to happen, not because the United States has some ulterior motive in order to divide the Arab and the Muslim world, but rather because the Palestinians cannot satisfy Israel's minimum requirements for peace, and Israel cannot satisfy Palestine's minimum requirements for peace. That's a very, very difficult situation for the United States to mediate, but it does not have anything to do with any kind of foreign hand or foreign conspiracy or any connection to the Arab uprisings. There's just simply no evidence of it.
ये थे अमेरिका से तशरीफ लाए स्टीवन ए कुक, जो अमेरिका के सेंटर ऑन फॉरेन रिलेशन से वाबस्ता हैं. इनसे गुफ्तगू हो रही थी शाम से मुतालिक और मशरिक़ वस्ता के मुख्तलिफ जो मसाइल हैं उससे मुतालिक. हमारे खास प्रोग्राम एक मुलाकात में आज बस इतना है. आप हमारे चैनल से मुतालिक अपनी राय और मशवरे हमें जरूर भेजिए. हमें दीजिए इजाजत, यानी खालिद रजा को दीजिए इजाजत. आदाब.
ये बॉस का है.
जॉगिंग ट्रक माँ.
जॉगिंग ट्रक नहीं होता है, ट्रैक होता है.
जॉगिंग ट्रक होता है, ट्रक.